Welcome back to Major Antonio's presentation of London to Ladysmith via Pretoria by Winston S. Churchill. Today, 125 years ago, the future Prime Minister reported from the fronts of the Boer War in South Africa. We shall follow his footsteps as he narrates his adventures himself. Subscribe to our channel so as not to miss anything. Chapter 26, The Relief of Ladysmith. Commandant's Office, Durban, March 9, 1900.
The successful action of the 27th had given Sir R.M.S. Buller possession of the whole of the left and center of the Pieters position, and in consequence of these large sections of their entrenchments having fallen into British hands, the Boers evacuated the remainder and retreated westward onto the high hills and northward towards Bulwana Mountain. About 90 prisoners were captured in the assault, and more than 100 bodies were counted in the trenches. After making allowances for the fact that these men were for the most part killed by shell fire, and that therefore the proportion of killed to wounded would necessarily be higher than if the loss were caused by bullets, it seems probable that no less than 300 wounded were removed. 40 were collected by British ambulance parties. Of the Boers who were killed in the retreat, no accurate estimate can be formed, but the dongas and kopjes beyond the position were strewn with occasional corpses. Undoubtedly, the enemy was hard hit in personnel, and the fact that we had taken 2 miles of entrenchments, as well as considerable stores of ammunition, proved that a very definite and substantial success had been won. But we were not prepared for the complete results that followed the operations of the 27th. Neither the general nor his army expected to enter Ladysmith without another action. Before us, a smooth plain, apparently unobstructed, ran to the foot of Bulwana, but from this forbidding eminence, a line of ridges and kopjes was drawn to the high hills of Doornklof and seemed to interpose another serious barrier. It was true that this last position was within range, or almost within range, of Sir George White's guns, so that its defenders might be caught between 2 fires. But we knew, and thought the Boers knew, that the Ladysmith garrison was too feeble from want of food and other privations to count for very much. So Sir R.M.S. Buller, facing the least satisfactory assumption, determined to rest his army on the 28th and attack Bulwana Hill on March 1st. He accordingly sent a message by heliograph into Ladysmith to say that he had beaten the enemy thoroughly, and was sending on his cavalry to reconnoiter. Ladysmith had informed herself, however, of the state of the game. Captain Tilney, from his balloon, observed all that passed in the enemy's lines on the morning of the 28th. At first, when he heard no artillery fire, he was depressed and feared lest the relieving army had retreated again. Then, as it became day, he was sure that this was not so, for the infantry in crowds were occupying the Boer position, and the mounted patrols pricked forward into the plain. Presently, he saw the Boers rounding up their cattle and driving them off to the north. Next, they caught and began to saddle their horses. The great white tilted wagons of the various laggers filed along the road around the eastern end of Bulwana. Lastly, up went a pair of shears over Long Tom, and at this he descended to the earth with the good news that the enemy were off at last. The garrison, however, had been mocked by false hopes before, and all steeled themselves to wait at least another 10 days. Meanwhile, since there was no fire from the enemy's side, our cavalry and artillery were rapidly and safely crossing the river. There was a considerable block at the bridge when the South African light horse arrived, and we had full leisure to examine the traffic. Guns, men, horses, and mules were hurrying across to the northern bank, and an opposing stream of wounded flowed steadily back to the south. I watched these with interest. First came a young officer riding a pony and smoking a cigarette, but very pale and with his left arm covered with bloody bandages. Brooke greeted him and asked, "Bone?" "Yes," replied the subaltern laconically, "shoulder smashed up." We expressed our sympathy. "Oh, that's all right. Good show, wasn't it? The men are awfully pleased." And he rode slowly on up the hill, the type of an unyielding race, and stoical besides. For wounds, especially shattered bones, grow painful after 12 or 14 hours. A string of wounded passed by on stretchers, some lying quite still, others sitting up and looking about them, One also an officer, a dark, black-mustached captain, whose eyes were covered with a bandage, kept his bearers busy with continual impatient questions. "Yes, but what I want to know is this. Did they get into them with the bayonet?" The volunteer stretcher-bearers could make no satisfactory reply, but said, "Yes, they give 'em L, sir." "Where, on the left of Railway Hill?" "Oh, everywhere, sir." The group passed by, and the last thing I heard was, "How much of the artillery has crossed? Are they sending the cavalry over? What the—" Presently came stretchers with wounded Boers. Most of these poor creatures were fearfully shattered. One tall man, with a great fierce beard and fine features, had a fragment of rock or iron driven through his liver. He was, moreover, stained bright yellow with lyddite, but did not seem in much pain, for he looked very calm and stolid. The less seriously injured among the soldiers hobbled back alone or assisted by their comrades. I asked a smart-looking sergeant of the Dublin Fusiliers, who was limping along with a broken foot, whether the regiment had been again heavily engaged. Of course they had. "Sure, we're always in the thick of it. Sorry, mister." "Was hit?" "No, not badly. Only his wrist. But there's not many of the officers left. Only 2 now who were at Talana." At last the time came for the cavalry to cross the bridge, and as we filed on to the floating roadway, we were amused to see a large finger-post at the entrance, on which the engineers had neatly painted, "To Ladysmith." The brigade passed over the neck between Railway and Inniskilling Hills, and we massed in a suitable place on the descending slopes beyond. We looked at the country before us and saw that it was good. Here at last was ground cavalry could work on at some speed. Ladysmith was still hidden by the remaining ridges, but we thought that somehow, and with a little luck, we might have a look at it before night. Under Bulwana, the wagons of the Boers and several hundred horsemen could be seen hurrying away. It was clearly our business to try to intercept them unless they had made good covering dispositions. Patrols were sent out in all directions, and a squadron of Thornycroft's mounted infantry proceeded to Peter's Station, where a complete train of about 20 trucks had been abandoned by the enemy. While this reconnaissance was going on, I climbed up Inniskilling Hill to examine the trenches. It was occupied by the East Surrey Regiment, and the soldiers were very eager to do the honors. They had several things to show. "Come along here, sir. There's a bloke here without a head. Took clean off, sir," and were mightily disappointed that I would not let them remove the blanket which covered the grisly shape. The trench was cut deep in the ground, and unlike our trenches, there was scarcely any parapet. A few great stones had been laid in front, but evidently the Boer believed in getting well into the ground. The bottom was knee-deep in cartridge cases, and every few yards there was an enormous heap of Mauser ammunition, thousands of rounds, all fastened neatly, 5 at a time in clips. A large proportion were covered with bright green slime, which the soldiers declared was poison, but which on analysis may prove to be wax, used to preserve the bullet. The Boers, however, were not so guiltless of other charges. A field officer of the East Surreys, recognizing me, came up and showed me an expansive bullet of a particularly cruel pattern. The tip had been cut off, exposing the soft core, and 4 slits were scored down the side. Whole boxes of this ammunition had been found. An officer who had been making calculations told me that the proportion of illegal bullets was nearly 1 in 5. I should not myself have thought it was so large, but certainly the improper bullets were very numerous. I have a specimen of this particular kind by me as I write, and I am informed by people who shoot big game that it is the most severe bullet of its kind yet invented. 5 other sorts have been collected by the medical officers, who have also tried to classify the wounds they respectively produce. I cannot be accused of having written unfairly about the enemy. Indeed, I have only cared to write what I thought was the truth about everybody. I have tried to do justice to the patriotic virtues of the Boers, and it is now necessary to observe that the character of these people reveals, in stress, a dark and spiteful underside. A man, I use the word in its fullest sense, does not wish to lacerate his foe, however earnestly he may desire his life. The popping of musketry made me hasten to rejoin my regiment. The squadron of mounted infantry had reached Peter's railway station, only to be heavily fired on from a low hill to the westward, and they now came scampering back with half a dozen riderless horses. Happily, the riders mostly arrived on foot after a few minutes, but it was evidently necessary to push forward very carefully. Indeed, it is hard to imagine how pursuits will occur in future war. 100 bold men with magazine rifles on a ridge can delay a whole army. The cavalry must reconnoiter and retire. Infantry and guns must push forward. Meanwhile, the beaten troops are moving steadily to safety. In a little while, to revert to the narrative, the horse artillery battery came up, and the offending hill was conscientiously shelled for an hour. Then the patrols crept forward again, but progress was necessarily slow. We were still 6 miles from Ladysmith at 3 o'clock. At this hour, the Boer ambulances had been invited to come for such of their wounded as could be moved. For since the enemy returned our wounded from Spion Kop, we have followed the practice of sending back theirs on all occasions should they prefer it. Anxious to find out the impression produced on the Boers by the late actions, I hastened to meet the ambulances, which, preceded by 3 horsemen carrying a large white flag, were now coming from the direction of Bulwana. They were stopped at our cavalry picket line, and a report of their arrival was sent back to the nearest brigadier. Their leader was a fine old fellow of the genuine Veld Boer type. He spoke English fluently, and we were soon in conversation. Cronje's surrender had been officially announced to us on the previous day, and I inquired whether he had heard of it. He replied that he knew Cronje was in difficulties, but understood he had managed to escape with his army. As for the surrender, it might be true or it might be false. We are told so many lies that we believe nothing. But his next remark showed that he realized that the tide had begun to turn. I don't know what we poor Afrikanders have done that England won't let us be a nation. I would have replied that I remembered having heard something about driving the English into the sea, but I have been over this ground before in every sense and knew the futility of any discussion. Indeed, when the debate is being conducted with shells, bullets, and bayonets, words are feeble weapons. So I said with an irony which was quite lost on him, "It must be all those damned capitalists," and this, of course, won his complete agreement, so that he confided that losing the position we had taken on the 27th was a sore and bitter blow. It happened that 2 squadrons of the 13th Hussars had ridden forward beyond us towards Bulwana, and at this moment the Boer artillery began to shell them rather heavily. We watched the proceedings for a few minutes, and the Boer was much astonished to see soldiers riding leisurely forward in regular though open order without paying the slightest attention to the shrapnel. Then several more squadrons were ordered to support the reconnaissance. A great company of horsemen jingled past the halted ambulances and cantered off in the direction of the firing. My companion regarded these steadfastly. Then he said, "Why do they all look so pleased?" "Because they think they are going to fight, but they will not be allowed to. It is only desired to draw your fire and reconnoiter." The whole plain was now occupied by cavalry, both brigades being on the move. "Little did we think a week ago," said the Boer, "that we should see such a sight as this, here in this plain. Didn't you think we should get through?" "No, we didn't believe it possible." "And you find the soldiers brave?" "They do not care for life." "And Ladysmith?" "Ah," his eye brightened, "there's pluck, if you like. Wonderful." Then we agreed that it was a sad and terrible war, and whoever won, we would make the gold mines pay, so that the damned capitalists should not think they had scored, and thus we parted. I afterwards learned that the Boer ambulances removed 27 of their wounded. The condition of the others was too serious to allow of their being moved, and in spite of every attention, they all died while in our hands. When I rejoined the South African Light Horse, the irregular brigade had begun to advance again. Major Gough's composite regiment had scouted the distant ridge and found it unoccupied. Now Dundonald moved his whole command thither, and with his staff climbed to the top. But to our disappointment, Ladysmith was not to be seen. 2 or 3 other ridges hung like curtains before us. The afternoon had passed, and it was already after 6 o'clock. The Boer artillery was still firing, and it seemed rash to attempt to reconnoiter further when the ground was broken and the light fading. The order was given to retire, and the movement had actually begun, when a messenger came back from Gough with the news that the last ridge between us and the town was unoccupied by the enemy, that he could see Ladysmith, and that there was for the moment a clear run in. Dundonald immediately determined to go on himself into the town with the 2 squadrons who were scouting in front, and to send the rest of the brigade back to camp. He invited me to accompany him, and without delay we started at a gallop. Never shall I forget that ride. The evening was deliciously cool. My horse was strong and fresh, for I had changed him at midday. The ground was rough with many stones, but we cared little for that. Beyond the next ridge, or the rise beyond that, or around the corner of the hill, was Ladysmith, the goal of all our hopes and ambitions during weeks of almost ceaseless fighting. Ladysmith, the center of the world's attention, the scene of famous deeds, the cause of mighty efforts. Ladysmith was within our reach at last. We were going to be inside the town within an hour. The excitement of the moment was increased by the exhilaration of the gallop. Onward, wildly, recklessly, up and down hill, over the boulders, through the scrub, Hubert Gough with his 2 squadrons, Mackenzie's Natal Carabineers, and the Imperial Light Horse were clear of the ridges already. We turned the shoulder of a hill, and there before us lay the tin houses and dark trees we had come so far to see and save. The British guns on Caesar's camp were firing steadily in spite of the twilight. What was happening? Never mind, we were nearly through the dangerous ground. Now we were all on the flat. Brigadier, staff, and troops let their horses go. We raced through the thorn bushes by Intombi Spruit. Suddenly there was a challenge. Halt! Who goes there? The Ladysmith relief column, and thereat, from out of trenches and rifle pits, artfully concealed in the scrub, a score of tattered men came running, cheering feebly, and some were crying. In the half-light they looked ghastly pale and thin. A poor, white-faced officer waved his helmet to and fro and laughed foolishly, and the tall, strong colonial horsemen, standing up in their stirrups, raised a loud, resounding cheer, for then we knew we had reached the Ladysmith picket line. Presently we arranged ourselves in military order. Natal Carabineers, an Imperial Light Horse, riding 2 and 2 abreast, so that there might be no question about precedence. And with Gough, the youngest regimental commander in the army, and one of the best, at the head of the column, we forded the Klip River and rode into the town. That night, I dined with Sir George White, who had held the town for 4 months against all comers, and was placed next to Hamilton, who won the fight at Elandslaagte and beat the Boers off Wagon Hill, and next but one to Hunter, whom everyone said was the finest man in the world. Never before had I sat in such brave company, nor stood so close to a great event. As the war drives slowly to its close, more substantial triumphs, larger battles, wherein the enemy suffers heavier loss, the capture of towns, and the surrender of armies may mark its progress. But whatever victories the future may have in store, the defense and relief of Ladysmith, because they afford, perhaps, the most remarkable examples of national tenacity and perseverance which our later history contains, will not be soon forgotten by the British people, whether at home or in the colonies.
This concludes today's reading of London to Ladysmith via Pretoria, by Winston S. Churchill. Join us also tomorrow for the final chapter. Subscribe to Major Antonio's channel. Thanks for listening, and so long.